Christmas Eve in New England possesses an almost sacred stillness, a silence woven from gently falling snow and quiet anticipation. Outside, the world was cloaked in a pristine white, the large, soft flakes descending slowly and steadily, muffling all the sounds of the outside world. The street in front of their house, usually bustling with passing cars, was now silent, save for the occasional crunch of tires on the thick snow. Inside the two-story colonial-style home, the fire in the stone hearth danced merrily, crackling and casting a warm amber glow that banished the chill of the winter night. The firelight threw shadows on the walls, making the framed family photos hanging there seem to come alive. Leo, 17, was curled up in a soft leather armchair, a plaid wool blanket draped over his legs. He wasn't reading a book or scrolling through his phone. He was simply soaking in the moment. The scent of the tall Fraser fir, meticulously decorated in the corner of the living room, mingled with the sweet aroma of gingerbread cookies his stepmother, Brenda, had just taken out of the oven, and the faint, woody smell of smoke from the fireplace. It was the symphony of Christmas scents, a blend that, for years, Leo had tried to associate with a feeling of safety and happiness. Sometimes, he almost succeeded. His father, Robert, sat on the sofa opposite him, a look of contentment on his face. He was a man of quiet gestures, an architect who spent more time in contemplation than in conversation. His love for Leo was a steady and constant undercurrent, expressed in the way he'd place a hand on Leo's shoulder when passing by, or how he always remembered that Leo liked his hot chocolate with an extra marshmallow. Tonight, he had just returned from a short business trip to Chicago, and his presence in the house was like an anchor, keeping everything stable and peaceful, a peace that Leo knew was incredibly fragile. Brenda was moving about the living room, arranging the gifts under the Christmas tree. She had been married to Robert for 5 years, since Leo was 12, and throughout that time, their relationship had been a complex and cautious dance. Brenda could be a master of superficial grace. She had a perfect smile, a refined fashion sense, and the ability to make any room she entered feel more organized and beautiful. To the outside world, she was the ideal stepmother. But Leo, who lived with her under the same roof, had learned to read the subtle signs behind that mask. He knew her kindness had clear limits, and her affection for his father didn't seem to extend to him. There were days she treated him with a cold indifference, almost as if he were an unwelcome piece of furniture. And then there were days like today, when she was unusually kind, which made Leo feel even more uneasy. "Leo, honey," she said, her voice as sweet as honey. She held up a gift box, carefully wrapped in deep red paper and tied with a magnificent gold bow. "This is for you. I saw it at the mall and thought of you immediately." Leo sat up straighter, a familiar sense of wariness creeping into his gut. He took the gift, his fingers brushing against the smooth wrapping paper. "Thanks, Brenda," he said, trying to make his voice sound appreciative. "You didn't have to." "Oh, don't be silly," she interrupted, waving a hand gracefully. "It's Christmas. Of course you did." She smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach her cold blue eyes. "Just promise me you won't open it until tomorrow morning. I want to see your face." He placed the gift under the tree, next to a few others from his father and grandmother. It sat there, shiny and perfect, a promise of Christmas joy. But to Leo, it felt like a foreign object, an anomaly in their already fragile family ecosystem. Brenda's sudden kindness always felt like an investment, a prelude to some future request or event. Maybe she wanted something from his father. Maybe she was trying to score points before his upcoming business trip. Robert watched the scene with a warm smile, completely oblivious to the undercurrent of tension. "That's wonderful, honey," he said to Brenda. "I'm so glad to see you two getting along." "Of course, darling," Brenda replied, walking over and planting a light kiss on his cheek. "We're a family after all." The word family echoed in Leo's ears, sounding hollow and artificial. He looked into the fire, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. He told himself he was overreacting, that he should be grateful for this peace, however temporary it might be. He took a deep breath, trying to focus on the good things. His father was home, it was snowing outside, and tomorrow was Christmas. For a moment, he let himself believe in the illusion. He allowed himself to sink into the warmth of the room, into the false peace of the holy night, completely unaware that it was merely the dead calm before the storm, and that the glittering gift was not a symbol of affection, but a tombstone for his childhood. Leo's sleep that night was not deep. It was more like a shallow pool of water, disturbed by fitful dreams and an unnamed sense of unease. He dreamt he was walking down an endless hallway, the walls made of red gift wrap, and the gleaming gold bow from Brenda's present hovered just out of reach, mocking him. He drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of the sound of floorboards creaking downstairs, the refrigerator door closing, and then, finally, silence settling over the house. He fell into a deeper sleep just before dawn, a brief surrender to exhaustion. He was awakened not by the gentle light of Christmas morning filtering through his curtains, but by a violent chaos. It started as a distant sound in his dream, a crashing, a dragging, but it quickly grew louder, closer, invading his consciousness until it became an undeniable reality. His bedroom door flew open, slamming against the wall with a bang that shook the entire room. Leo's eyes shot open, his heart leaping into his throat. For a panicked moment, he thought they were being robbed. But then he saw the figure standing silhouetted in the doorway, and a different, more familiar and profound fear replaced the initial one. It was Brenda. But not the Brenda he knew, not the elegant woman with the controlled smile. This was another version of her, a primal and terrifying one. Her blonde hair was a disheveled mess, her silk emerald robe hanging askew. Her face, usually so carefully made up, was flushed and contorted with a raw, long-suppressed rage. Her eyes were wide, no longer coldly calculating, but blazing with a manic fury. "Get up!" she roared, her voice hoarse and shrill, stripped of all its sweetness. "Get up, you freeloader! Your free ride is over!" Leo scrambled into a sitting position in bed, the comforter pooling around his waist, leaving him in just an old t-shirt and plaid pajama pants. The room was cold, and the chill seemed to emanate directly from Brenda. He stared at her, utterly stunned, trying to process what was happening. Where was his father? Surely he wouldn't allow this. What are you doing?" he stammered, his voice weak and lost in his own room. "Where's Dad?" Brenda let out a laugh, a harsh and contemptuous sound. "Your dad? Your dad is on a plane to Boston, you idiot. He can't save you. He left you here with me." And then, with a horrifying clarity, Leo understood. His father's early morning flight, Brenda's unusual kindness last night, it was all part of a plan. She had been waiting. She had waited for the perfect moment, when he was completely alone and unprotected. Before Leo could react, Brenda sprang into action. She grabbed a roll of black trash bags from the hallway and ripped one free. With surprising strength, she knocked over the chair at his desk, then began sweeping everything from its surface. Textbooks, papers, the laptop he had spent all summer working to buy, all of it was thrown violently into the bag. The sound of plastic colliding, of paper being crumpled, of the hard covers of books slamming together created a symphony of destruction. "No!" Leo yelled, finally finding his voice. He threw off the covers and stood, but a sense of hesitation rooted him to the spot. Brenda's rage was too intense, almost feral. He had never seen anyone like this in his life. She paid no attention to his protest. She moved with a systematic and brutal efficiency, like a tornado tearing through everything in its path. She ripped his favorite rock band posters from the walls, leaving jagged tears in the paint. She pulled open his dresser drawers and dumped the contents onto the floor, then scooped up the clothes with both arms and stuffed them into a second bag. Sweaters, jeans, underwear, all of it was mixed together in a chaotic jumble. Leo's initial shock was giving way to a paralyzing horror. This wasn't just anger, this was an exorcism. She didn't just want him out of the house, she wanted to erase every trace of his existence. Every item thrown into a trash bag was a piece of his life being discarded. He looked around his room, his sanctuary, the place that held his dreams, his secrets, and his true self, and saw it being dismantled before his very eyes. His reality, the small, safe world he had tried to build for himself within this house, wasn't just cracking. It was being torn asunder, and he was left standing in the wreckage, shivering in his pajamas, facing the fury of a woman who had waited 5 years to enact her revenge. There is a weapon in the most ordinary of objects, an ability to inflict profound psychological devastation hidden within things we use every day without a second thought. A cardboard box, however hasty, still suggests transition. It is designed to protect its contents, to move them from one place to another. A suitcase implies even more. It speaks of journeys, new beginnings, destinations. But a black plastic trash bag carries a different message entirely, one that is stark and unmistakable. It does not speak of transition, it speaks of disposal. It does not protect, it conceals and contains filth. It is the final destination for an object before it ceases to exist, crushed and buried. And Brenda, with a venomous precision that could only come from long-harbored hatred, had chosen her weapon perfectly. Leo stood frozen, his bare feet cold on the hardwood floor, and watched the assault on his life. It was more than an assault. It was a systematic dehumanization, carried out by treating his possessions as if they were garbage. Because if everything that defines you, all the tangible expressions of your being, is mere trash, then what are you? He watched as Brenda snatched his favorite baseball cap from his bedpost, an old, faded Red Sox hat that had been with him through countless summers. It smelled of cut grass and sunscreen, a vessel of memory. She crumpled it in her hand and tossed it into the bag with contempt. Next came his collection of model airplanes that he and his father had built together. One by one, the carefully crafted Spitfires, Mustangs, and Messerschmitts were swept from their shelf and thrown into the dark maw of the bag, the sound of delicate plastic snapping echoing in the room. Each crack was a severing of a bond with his father. But the cruelest attack was on the irreplaceable. Brenda moved to Leo's bedside table, where he kept a small picture frame. Inside was the only surviving photograph of him and his biological mother, taken at a fall fair a year before she died of cancer. In it, he was a 6-year-old boy, perched on her shoulders, both of them beaming, their faces smudged with powdered sugar from a funnel cake. It was his sacred relic, tangible proof of an unconditional love that had once existed. "What's this?" Brenda muttered, picking up the frame. She looked at it for a second, her face impassive. "Don't," Leo whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, don't." Brenda looked up at him, a flicker of a cruel smirk on her lips. She didn't throw it in the bag. She did something worse. She opened the tabs on the back of the frame, sliding the photo out. Then, right in front of Leo, she tore the photograph in half, then in quarters, and let the small pieces of paper flutter to the floor like confetti at a funeral. "Too much clutter," she said, almost to herself, before tossing the empty frame into the trash bag. A sharp, physical pain, more intense than any blow, shot through Leo's chest. He couldn't breathe. She wasn't just throwing away his things, she was erasing his history. She was trying to expunge the memory of his mother, to assert that the only real family was the one she was trying to create with his father. That act of tearing the photo was the ultimate declaration of power, a way of saying that even the most sacred parts of his past were not safe from her hatred. By the time the third bag was tied off, Leo's room was mostly empty. Only the large pieces of furniture remained, the bed, the dresser, the desk. But the soul of the room was gone, vacuumed into the 3 black bags that now sat, bloated and grotesque, in the middle of the floor. They didn't just contain clothes and books. They contained 17 years of a life, the small triumphs, the quiet sorrows, the cherished memories, and the hopes for the future. All of it, jumbled together, compressed, and labeled as refuse. Leo looked at those bags, and for the first time in his life, he felt the complete emptiness of despair. He had been dispossessed, degraded, and reduced to something less than human. He was just a collection of disposable items, waiting to be taken out. The numbness that had enveloped Leo, a thick, cold blanket of shock, had muted all coherent thought. He could only stand there, a silent witness to the demolition of his life, the sound of his mother's photograph being torn still echoing in his ears. But then, as Brenda turned to face him, her eyes blazing with a kind of malignant triumph, that blanket began to tear. Underneath it, there wasn't sadness, but a rising tide of rage, a desperate rebellion against the sheer, unadulterated wrongness of it all. Why? The question escaped his lips, hoarse and barely audible, but in the heavy silence of the ravaged room, it landed like a gunshot. Brenda snorted, a sound of pure contempt. "Why? You dare to ask me why?" She took a step toward him, her focus no longer on the trash bags. Now, her full attention, all her venom, was aimed at him. "You are why. You've been here, in my house, eating my food, breathing my air for 5 years. Like a leech, sucking the life and happiness out of my family." Leo shook his head, trying to fend off the poisonous words. "That's not, Dad loves me. This is his house too. His house!" Brenda let out a sharp, barking laugh. "This house is for him and me. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a clean slate. But you were always here, a stain from his past that couldn't be scrubbed out. You're her ghost, walking the halls, with her eyes, her same way of walking. You think I don't see it?" She was talking about his mother. The raw, ugly truth was now laid bare. Brenda's animosity wasn't just the simple irritation of dealing with a stepson. It was a sick, obsessive jealousy, a resentment toward a dead woman she could never compete with. And Leo, by his very existence, was the living embodiment of that woman. Every time Robert looks at you with that love in his eyes, she continued, her voice dropping to a hateful hiss, I know a part of him still belongs to her. You are the anchor tying him to the past. And today, I'm cutting the rope. The cruelty of the confession stunned Leo. He wasn't a person to her. He was a symbol, an obstacle to her happiness. His initial rage began to cool, replaced by a chilling sense of emptiness. How do you argue with a hatred so irrational? He tried one last time, clinging to a final shred of logic. But we're a family. You said so last night. That seemed to snap the last thread of her control. Brenda's face contorted into a mask of pure fury. She lunged forward and grabbed Leo by the shoulders, her fingers digging into the thin fabric of his t-shirt. She shook him, her face inches from his, and he could feel her hot breath on his skin. And then she roared, each syllable spat out like a curse, the words that would become the foundation of his nightmares, the words that would reshape his understanding of himself and his place in the world. You are not my real family. The last 4 words were hammered home with a terrible force, an unshakable certainty. They weren't an opinion, they were a verdict. In that moment, Brenda was no longer just an angry stepmother. She was a judge, an executioner, and she had just pronounced a death sentence on Leo's sense of belonging. The word family, a word he had tried to associate with safety and inclusion, had been turned into a weapon and used against him. She had redefined it, drawing a small, cozy circle that included only herself and Robert, and had violently cast Leo out of it. He was an outsider, an unwanted intruder, a mistake to be corrected. That declaration of rejection was more than an eviction from a house. It was an expulsion from the very concept of belonging. It left a wound deeper than any cut, a void that he knew would take a very long time to fill. The shock from Brenda's verdict paralyzed Leo. The words still hung in the heavy air of the room, echoing in his mind, drowning out all other thoughts. You are not my real family. It felt like a life sentence, with no chance of parole. Knocked off balance by the force of that rejection, Leo barely felt Brenda's hands release his shoulders and shove him backward. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the now empty desk. Survival instinct, however faint, finally flickered to life deep within his stupor. He had to get out of there. To stay another moment was torture, but not like this, not in this state of raw vulnerability. His eyes scanned the ravaged room, searching for something, anything to cling to as a last shred of dignity. He saw it, the pair of jeans and navy blue sweater he had worn yesterday, slung over the back of the only remaining chair in the room. They were just a few feet away. They were armor, a shell to hide the shattering that had occurred within. To put them on would be to face the world as a semi-normal person, not a victim stripped bare. Wait, he managed to say, his voice hoarse from shock and lack of air. He held up a hand, a weak, pleading gesture. Just a minute, let me get dressed. The request, so simple and basic, seemed to momentarily surprise Brenda. She looked at him, then at the jeans, and a flicker of cruel understanding lit up her eyes. She understood exactly what he was asking for, not just warmth, but self-respect. And in that instant, she realized she had one final opportunity to utterly crush him. A slow, merciless smile spread across her face. Get dressed, Leo? She repeated, savoring the words. What for? So you can look presentable while you beg on the street? Or so you can pretend you're a normal young man and not a pathetic little boy who just got thrown out of his home? She stepped forward, positioning herself between him and the chair. Don't you get it? You don't make requests here anymore. You have no rights. You will leave like this. In your ridiculous pyjamas. She looked him up and down with theatrical disdain, from his faded t-shirt to his slightly too short plaid flannel pants that exposed his bare ankles. This is who you really are. A helpless, pathetic child. I want the whole world to see it. I want you to remember this moment every time you look in the mirror. The calculated cruelty of this act surpassed everything that had come before. This was not blind rage. This was a deliberate and calculated form of psychological torture. Pajamas are the uniform of privacy, of the safety of the bedroom, of innocence. By forcing him to wear them out into the cold world, Brenda was stripping him of his final protective layer. She was turning him into a spectacle, an object of pity and ridicule. She was ensuring that his humiliation would not be contained within the walls of this house, but would be put on public display. No, Leo whispered, a final, feeble protest. He took a step toward the chair. Brenda moved like lightning. She grabbed his arm, her red-painted fingernails digging into his flesh. "I said no," she snarled, her strength fueled by pure hatred. She began to pull him out of the room, out of his desecrated sanctuary. A feeling of complete powerlessness washed over Leo. He was taller and probably stronger than her, but the shock and despair had drained him of all his strength. He let her drag him, his bare feet sliding on the cold wooden floor. Each step was a surrender, an admission of his defeat. He had been stripped of his home, his possessions, his past, and now his dignity. He would not be leaving this house as a defeated warrior. He would be cast out like a punished child, exposed in his vulnerability, a living lesson in humiliation that she intended to brand into his soul forever. And as they reached the top of the stairs leading down to the main floor, he knew his walk of shame had only just begun. The staircase leading downstairs felt like a descent into hell. Each cold wooden step beneath Leo's bare feet was a move closer to the final expulsion. Brenda still had a firm grip on his arm, pulling him along without a shred of mercy. As they passed the living room, which only hours before had been a scene of domestic peace, Leo cast a desperate glance. The Christmas tree still stood there, a silent, glittering witness to the tragedy. The half-drunk mugs of cocoa were still on the coffee table. The gift wrapped in red paper still lay under its branches, a cruel mockery. The house was still intact, warm and inviting, but it was no longer his. He was a ghost being chased out of his own haunting ground. Brenda didn't pause. She dragged him through the living room, through the front hall, and to the heavy oak door that led to the outside world. She twisted the cold brass doorknob, and with a groan, the door swung open. A wall of frigid morning air rushed in, a physical and brutal assault. It stole his breath and instantly raised goosebumps on the bare skin of his arms and face. The cold was more than a temperature. It carried the harshness of the outside world, the indifference of nature to human suffering. Outside, the scene was brutally beautiful. A thick, pristine, and unbroken blanket of white snow covered everything, glittering under the faint early morning light. The bare branches of the trees were coated in a layer of frost, looking like glass sculptures. The air was crisp and silent, save for the soft whistle of the wind through the eaves. A perfect Christmas card world, in complete opposition to the chaos and ugliness inside the house. Brenda began to execute the final part of her plan. She released Leo's arm and turned back, moving quickly towards the stairs. A moment later, she returned, dragging the first of the trash bags. Her body was tense with the effort, her face flushed. With a guttural grunt, she heaved the bag out the door. It sailed through the air for a second, a dark, misshapen form against the white snow, before landing on the concrete steps with a heavy, wet thud. It rolled once more and came to rest on the front lawn, a hideous black scar on the perfect white blanket of winter. The second and third bags followed, each one tossed out with an undisguised contempt and hatred. They lay scattered on the lawn, like the corpses of slain monsters. One of the bags had torn slightly, revealing the corner of a hardcover book and the sleeve of a gray hoodie. Leo's life, packaged and discarded, now lay exposed for the world to see. "There," Brenda panted, hands on her hips. She turned to Leo, who was still standing frozen in the doorway, his body racked with uncontrollable shivers. "Take your trash and get out. Don't ever come back here." Leo couldn't move. His feet felt fused to the floor. Part of him still couldn't believe this was really happening. This had to be a nightmare. He would wake up soon in his warm bed, and all of this would be just a bad memory. But the bone-deep chill seeping through his thin clothing was real. The sharp pain in his bare soles on the frigid threshold was real. The look of pure hatred on Brenda's face was real. "Are you deaf?" she screamed, her patience gone. "I said get out!" And then she placed both hands on his back and shoved, hard. Leo stumbled forward, thrown off balance. He tripped on the top step but managed to catch himself before he fell completely. His bare feet sank deep into the thick, freezing snow on the walkway. The sensation was horrific, a jolt of pure pain that shot from his soles all the way up to his brain. He turned around, his mouth open to say something, anything, but it was too late. The heavy oak door slammed shut in his face. A loud click echoed as the deadbolt was thrown from the inside. And that was it. He was outside, alone, locked out of the house he had called home for 5 years. The silence of Christmas morning was now deafening, oppressive, and absolute. There were no more shouts from Brenda, No more sounds of destruction, just the whisper of the wind and the frantic, heavy beat of his own heart in his chest, a solitary drum in a silent, cold world. The act of expulsion was complete. He had been cut off, cast out, and left to face the harshness of winter with only his pajamas and a shattered life in trash bags. The physical cold was intense. It was a relentless assault on Leo's every nerve. The snow under his bare feet was melting into an icy slush that numbed his toes. The wind found its way through the thin flannel of his pajamas, making him shiver in violent, uncontrollable waves. But amid that physical agony, a truth that was colder, sharper than any winter wind, was slowly crystallizing in his mind. This truth didn't just chill him, it froze his soul. This was not a spontaneous act. This was not the result of an escalated argument or a sudden fit of rage. This was a meticulously planned execution. Standing in the snow, shivering and abandoned, Leo's mind began to rewind the past few weeks, even months, searching for the signs, the clues he had missed. And now, in the harsh light of reality, they appeared with terrifying clarity. The mosaic of Brenda's deception came together with a painful precision. He remembered the conversation at the dinner table about 3 weeks prior. His father, Robert, had gotten the call about the urgent business meeting in Boston. "Do you really have to go?" Brenda had asked, her voice laced with feigned disappointment. Right after Christmas? But Leo remembered her eyes. There had been a glint, a quick calculation that he hadn't understood at the time. "Oh well," she had added, "business is business. Just promise you'll be back as soon as you can." Now, that disappointment revealed itself as a clumsy piece of acting. She wasn't disappointed. She had seen her opening. He also remembered how, in recent days, Brenda had become strangely kind. She had asked him about his winter break plans, whether he was going to be away with friends. He had naively told her he'd just be at home, maybe visiting his grandmother a few times. He hadn't realized he was providing her with tactical intelligence, confirming that he would be an easy, isolated target with nowhere else to go immediately. The methodical cruelty of it was staggering. Brenda had lived with them, eaten at the same table, watched television with them, all while silently plotting to destroy his life. She had counted down the days until Robert's departure. She had chosen her moment perfectly. Christmas morning, a time when most places are closed, when his friends would be with their own families, when the outside world would be least likely to offer help. It was an act designed for maximum damage and isolation. His father's absence wasn't just an unfortunate coincidence. It was the cornerstone of Brenda's entire plan. She knew Robert would never have allowed this. He loved Leo, and while he might not have always recognized the simmering tension between his wife and son, he would have never stood by and watched his child be treated this way. Brenda knew that, and so she had waited until Leo's only shield was gone. This realization brought a new wave of anger, a hot fury that fought back against the cold enveloping him. He wasn't just the victim of a rage-fueled outburst. He was the target of a cold, calculated conspiracy. And that truth, somehow, was more painful than the eviction itself. It meant this rejection wasn't temporary. It was permanent, and had been preordained for a long time. Amid the swirling vortex of betrayal and the biting cold, Leo's gaze was involuntarily drawn to the large picture window of the living room. The thick glass, dotted with melting snowflakes, was like a screen separating two entirely different worlds. Outside, his harsh reality, a shivering teenager in pajamas, surrounded by the ruins of his life, exiled from the only shelter he knew. Inside, another world, an illusion of warmth and family happiness that, just hours ago, he had been a part of. And it was in that world that he saw it. Tucked beneath the dense lower branches of the Christmas tree, illuminated by the cheerful, blinking colored lights, was the gift box wrapped in deep red paper and tied with a gleaming gold bow. Brenda's gift. The gift she had given him with a smile, a promise of Christmas morning surprise. That image, in its silent, glittering perfection, struck Leo with more force than any scream or physical blow. It was an absurdity of the highest order, a contradiction so immense his mind could barely process it. It was the apex of hypocrisy, a masterpiece of psychological cruelty. For a brief, morbid moment, a sick curiosity rose within him. What was in the box? Was it something he actually wanted? Something carefully chosen to prove she knew him, cared about him? Was it the new video game he had mentioned a few weeks ago? A book by his favorite author? The possibility that she had actually put effort into selecting a meaningful gift, only to make the subsequent betrayal more painful, was terrifying. Or perhaps it was just something empty, a cheap, meaningless trinket bought only to complete her performance. But then he realized that the contents of the gift didn't matter at all. Its existence was what mattered. That act of gift-giving now appeared as one of the most diabolical acts he could imagine. It was not an act of kindness overshadowed by later anger. No, it was an integral part of the torture. It was the sugar coating on the poison pill. It was designed to lull him, and more importantly, to lull his father, into a false sense of security. It was the evidence Brenda could have presented if Robert had harbored any doubts. See, I love your son. I even bought him a Christmas gift. How could a person perform such an elaborate act of deception? How could she look him in the eye, hand him a symbol of affection, while in her mind she was silently planning his destruction? That duplicity, that ability to live so perfectly within a lie, was both astounding and repulsive. Leo stared at the gift through the steam-fogged window pane. It was no longer a beautifully wrapped box. It had transformed. It now looked like a time bomb, ticking down to the moment of detonation. It was a tangible taunt, a monument to Brenda's hypocrisy. Every fold in the wrapping paper was a lie. Every loop of the ribbon was a betrayal. It represented everything that had been stolen from him: the promise of a happy Christmas morning, the illusion of a harmonious family, and the naive belief that people, at their core, were good. He could imagine the scene later: Robert returning, seeing the gift still intact under the tree, and the full horror of the situation crashing down on him anew. The gift would sit there, a permanent and silent reminder of what happened, of the evil he had unwittingly allowed into his home. For Leo, that unopened gift would forever be the most potent symbol of that day. It was not a symbol of lost love, but of a love that had never existed in the first place. It was the final, irrefutable proof that Brenda didn't just dislike him. She despised him so thoroughly that she was willing to turn an act of kindness into an instrument of torture. And that image, the unwelcome gift, the glittering lie, would be seared into his soul, a scar that would never fully fade. As Leo stood there, paralyzed by the cold and haunted by the image of the false gift, his mind began to do a painful but necessary job. It started connecting the dots. What had initially been a vague sense of calculation was now crystallizing into a terrifying certainty. He wasn't just the victim of a cruel act on Christmas morning. He was the final target of a carefully planned campaign, a conspiracy that had been in motion for weeks, if not months, right under his nose. Small, insignificant memories now surfaced with a new, ominous meaning. He remembered, about a month ago, walking past Brenda's home office and seeing her intently focused on websites about family law. When she noticed his presence, she had quickly closed the tab, claiming she was helping a friend look into divorce proceedings. At the time, Leo hadn't thought anything of it, but now he wondered. Had she been researching custody statutes, looking for legal loopholes to have him legally removed from his father's life? The thought was nauseating, but it fit perfectly with the cold precision of what was happening. Then he recalled the hushed phone calls Brenda had been making over the past few weeks. She would often retreat into her bedroom or go out onto the back porch to talk, her voice lowered to a whisper. He had assumed they were private conversations with friends or family. But now, another, more sinister scenario presented itself. Was she talking to a lawyer? Or perhaps a banker, rearranging finances in preparation for the rupture she was engineering? Other small details flooded back. The way Brenda had suddenly become interested in Robert's schedule, particularly his business trips. "Are you sure that trip is only for 2 days, honey?" she had asked a few days ago. "No chance they'll keep you longer?" That wasn't the concern of a worried wife. It was the diligence of a strategist confirming the time frame for her attack. He also remembered how she had subtly been planting seeds of discord. She would tell small, seemingly harmless stories to Robert about Leo's messiness or thoughtlessness. "Leo forgot to take out the trash again, dear," she would say with a theatrical sigh. "I've reminded him 3 times. Or, Leo's history grade slipped again. I'm worried he's not applying himself." Each small complaint, in isolation, seemed reasonable. But now, Leo saw them in a new light. They weren't complaints. They were part of a propaganda campaign, designed to slowly erode his image in his father's eyes, so that when the final purge came, Robert might be less shocked, perhaps even feel that Leo had brought it on himself. The realization was horrific. It meant that Brenda's hatred was not just a passive emotion, it was a project. She had approached the task of removing him from the family with the same kind of planning and attention to detail that his father devoted to his architectural blueprints. Every variable had been accounted for. Robert's absence, Leo's isolation on a holiday, the element of surprise. This transformed Brenda from a cruel stepmother into something else, something more frightening. She was a conspirator, a master manipulator who had hidden her true intentions behind a mask of normalcy. She had turned their home into a stage, and they had all, including Robert, been unwitting actors in her play of revenge. As the full truth of this conspiracy settled in, a strange feeling replaced Leo's initial fear and confusion. It was a cold clarity. He no longer felt like a lost child. He felt like a soldier who had survived a perfectly planned ambush. He had been defeated, overwhelmed, but he had survived. And this knowledge of his enemy, of the depths of their betrayal, gave him an unexpected strength. He knew exactly what he was up against, not a fleeting rage, but a deliberate, methodical, and remorseless evil. And that knowledge, however painful, would be his first weapon in the fight to rebuild his life. The cold clarity of Brenda's conspiracy offered no warmth. It only sharpened the cruelty of the situation. Leo knew he couldn't stand here forever. With every passing second, the cold seeped deeper, turning his fingers and toes into numb, useless appendages. He had to move. He had to get to his grandmother's house. It was the only lighthouse in the storm, the only fortress left in a world that had turned hostile. The distance wasn't great, about 2 miles. On a normal day, it would have been an easy walk, perhaps taking half an hour. But this was not a normal day. Today, those 2 miles stretched before him like a journey across the Arctic tundra. He bent down, his joints cracking from the cold, and tried to lift the first trash bag. It was surprisingly heavy, the weight of his books and electronics dragging it down. The thin, cold, and damp plastic stuck to his numb fingers. He tried to sling the handles of the other 2 bags over his shoulder, but they were too bulky and slick. Finally, he resigned himself to a method that was both inefficient and humiliating. He would have to drag them. And so, his journey began. 1 foot, then the other, sinking deep into the thick snow. Each step was an act of will. His bare feet screamed in silent protest. The biting cold was no longer on the surface. It had penetrated his skin, his muscles, and felt like it was gnawing at his bones. Each step left a raw, pathetic footprint in the snow, a trail of his desperation. He dragged the 3 trash bags behind him. They moved with difficulty, creating deep, meandering grooves in the pristine white snow. The only sound besides the wind was the ghostly rustle of plastic on snow, a soundtrack to his humiliation. Occasionally, a bag would snag on a hidden patch of ice or a snow-covered shrub, and he would have to stop, turn, and use what little strength he had left to wrench it free. The world around him was both beautiful and indifferent. His neighbors' houses were lavishly decorated, with Christmas wreaths on the doors and electric candles in every window. Through the still-drawn curtains, he could catch glimpses of lit Christmas trees, of families gathering, opening gifts, drinking coffee. They were living in the world from which he had just been expelled. He felt like a ghost passing by, unseen and belonging nowhere. A burning shame rose in his chest, stronger than the cold. He lowered his head, pulling the hood of his pajamas, a small mercy he was grateful for, over his face, praying that no one would look out their window and see this pathetic spectacle, a boy in his pajamas, dragging his life in trash bags through the Christmas morning snow. About half a mile in, one of the bags tore on the corner from the friction against a sharp piece of ice. A few items fell out: a comic book, a pair of socks, and the small trophy he had won at a middle school science fair. He stopped, looking at them lying there in the snow. Should he pick them up? He had no room to carry them. Leave them behind? It felt like abandoning a part of himself. In the end, he picked up the trophy, the cold metal searing his skin, and shoved it into the pocket of his pajama top. He left the comic book and the socks, the first casualties of the journey. He walked on, his body aching, his mind empty. He no longer thought about Brenda or his father. His entire existence had been reduced to a single objective: take one more step, drag the bags 1 more foot, survive the next 5 minutes. The road ahead seemed to stretch on infinitely, a white, featureless expanse with no end in sight. This 2-mile journey was no longer measured in distance. It was measured in pain, in humiliation, and in every ragged, shuddering breath he took in the freezing winter air. It was the pilgrimage of an outcast, and every step was a reminder of all that he had lost. Leo was a little over a mile into his journey, and his body was at its absolute limit. Every breath was a cloud of white vapor in the frigid air, and every heartbeat sent a wave of throbbing pain through his frozen feet. He reached a familiar street corner, where a public bench now buried under a thick layer of snow sat beneath a stark, old oak tree. He knew he had to stop, even for just a moment. His strength was gone. He let the trash bags fall, and they landed in the snow with a dull, heavy thud. He collapsed onto the edge of one of the bags, no longer caring about the damp cold seeping through his pajama pants. He dropped his head into his now purple hands and tried to breathe. The world around him was eerily quiet, the holiday silence broken only by his own ragged gasps. It was in this moment of desperate rest that a single spark of hope ignited. The phone. He could call his grandmother. He could tell her he was on his way, that he needed help. Just hearing her voice would be a comfort, a reminder that he wasn't entirely alone in the world. With clumsy, trembling fingers, he fumbled inside the pocket of his pajama top. He pulled out his old smartphone, an outdated model with a small crack in the corner of the screen. He pressed the power button, his heart quickening slightly with anticipation. Nothing happened. The screen remained black, lifeless. He pressed it again, holding it longer this time, his thumb mashing the button. Still nothing. The battery was dead. A cold feeling, unrelated to the temperature, spread through his chest. He remembered now, a faint memory from the night before. He had been using his phone until the battery was low and had meant to plug it in before bed, but had gotten distracted by the conversation in the living room and forgotten. "It's okay," he muttered to himself, trying to keep the panic from rising. "It's okay. I have a power bank. No, I don't. The charger. The charger is in the bag." A new surge of energy, fueled by panic, rose in him. He began to rummage through one of the trash bags, the one with his electronics. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely undo the knot Brenda had tied. Finally, he managed to rip a hole in the bag. He plunged his hand inside, feeling the coldness of metal and plastic objects. He pulled out a tangled mess of cables, headphones, a computer mouse, but no phone charger. He dumped part of the bag's contents onto the snow. Books, game cases, a small Bluetooth speaker, no charger. He moved to the second bag, tearing it open, his hands frantically pawing through the damp clothes. Nothing there either. The last bag was the same. And then the truth hit him, a truth so cruel and perfectly calculated it was almost unbelievable. Brenda had taken it. It wasn't an accident. In her destructive rage, amidst throwing clothes and books, she had possessed the presence of mind and the sheer malice to seek out something as small and mundane as his phone charger and deliberately remove it. She had known. She must have known his phone was likely to be low on battery. She had known it was his only lifeline to the world. And she had cut it. This was no longer just about kicking him out. This was a deliberate act of abandonment. She didn't just want him gone. She wanted him completely isolated, completely helpless. She wanted to ensure he couldn't call for help, couldn't call his father to expose her crime. She wanted him to disappear, to be swallowed by the silence and the cold. This realization was worse than the eviction itself. It was the final confirmation that she did not see him as a human being. Humans have a right to safety, a right to connection. She had stripped him of both. He sat there, amidst the ruined heap of his belongings in the snow, holding the useless phone in his hand. It was no longer a tool of connection. It was a symbol of his complete isolation. All around him, houses were still lit. Inside them, families were connecting, sharing moments. But for Leo, all lines of communication had been severed. He was truly, utterly alone, an island of despair in a silent, cold ocean. Despair is a dangerous thief. It doesn't just steal hope, it steals strength, the will to go on. Sitting on the snow-covered bench, holding the cold, useless phone, Leo felt a powerful temptation to give up. How easy it would be to just sit here, to let the cold slowly take over, to let the numbness turn into an eternal sleep. There would be no more pain, no more humiliation, no more loneliness. But then, through the fog of exhaustion, an image formed in his mind. It was the face of his grandmother, Evelyn. A face etched with the lines of laughter and worry, her gray-blue eyes always sparkling with a wise mischief. He remembered the smell of freshly baked banana bread that always filled her small kitchen, the feel of her warm, calloused hands holding his, the sound of her low, gentle voice telling stories about his mother's childhood. Her house. It wasn't just a building. It was a sanctuary, a haven that had sheltered him through the many storms of his life, his mother's death, his father's remarriage, the trials of adolescence. It was the one place in the world where he had always felt completely and unconditionally accepted. The thought of her, of the safety and love she represented, became a small spark in the cold darkness of his despair. It wasn't a roaring fire, just a faint flickering ember, but it was enough. It was enough to banish the temptation to surrender. He had to get there. He owed it to her, to the memory of his mother, and most importantly, to himself, not to let Brenda win. With a groan of pure agony, Leo forced his body to stand. His muscles, stiff and protesting, screamed. He gathered the items that had spilled, clumsily stuffing them back into the torn bag. He grabbed the trash bags, which now felt even heavier as the snow began to soak into them, and began to walk. The last half-mile was a hazy torture. He could no longer feel his feet. They were just numb stumps that he forced to move forward. His vision began to blur at the edges. But he kept going, his mind focused on a single image, the green front door of his grandmother's small cottage-style house. And then he saw it. At the end of the street, nestled behind a white picket fence, was her home. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a sign of warmth and life within. A simple but beautiful Christmas wreath hung on the green door. It looked like a mirage, an oasis in the snowy desert. A final surge of strength, fueled by relief, rose in him. He almost ran the last few steps, dragging the bags behind him, leaving a long, ugly scar on the pristine snow of her front walk. He climbed the 3 wooden steps, each one a monumental effort. He stood before the door, shivering uncontrollably. He raised his hand to knock, but his fingers were too numb to make a sound. He had to use the side of his fist, banging weakly on the door, twice. He heard the sound of hurried footsteps from inside, then the click of the deadbolt being drawn back. The door opened. Evelyn stood there, wearing an apron with a holly pattern, a wooden spoon in her hand, a bright Christmas smile on her face. "Leo, sweetheart, you're early." Her smile vanished. Her eyes widened, taking in the scene before her. She saw her grandson, clad only in a thin pair of pajamas, shaking like a leaf, his skin a pale bluish-white from the cold. She saw the frozen tear tracks on his cheeks. She looked down at his bare, swollen and red feet on the doormat. And then she saw the 3 black trash bags, the hideous symbols of rejection, lying on her porch. For a moment, she said nothing. The entire spectrum of human emotion seemed to pass across her face. Confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally, a cold, fierce rage that Leo had never seen in her before. But that rage was not for him. It was for the world that had done this to him. "Oh, child," she whispered, her voice breaking. She dropped the wooden spoon, and it clattered to the floor. She didn't ask a single question. There was no need. She reached out, her warm, strong hands grabbing Leo's arm and pulling him inside, out of the cold. She slammed the door shut behind him, sealing him off from the cruel world outside. As the warmth and familiar smells of the house enveloped him, Leo's last ounce of strength gave out. He began to collapse, and his grandmother was there to catch him. She held him tight, an embrace that was both powerful and gentle, and let him cry, dry, tearless sobs that racked his exhausted body. He had reached his sanctuary. He was saved, and in the arms of his true family, he finally allowed himself to break. Evelyn acted with the efficiency and decisiveness of someone who had weathered many crises in her life. She wasted no time on useless questions or lamentations. Leo's safety and health were the top priority. She guided him, still shaking and barely able to stand, to the large armchair next to the crackling fireplace. "Stay right there, sweetheart," she commanded, her voice both gentle and firm. "Don't move." She disappeared quickly and returned with a stack of thick wool blankets and a large bath towel. She wrapped them around Leo, creating a warm cocoon, and began to gently dry his damp hair. Then she brought a basin of warm water and a soft cloth, knelt on the cold floor, and began to carefully wash his bare feet, which were swollen, purple, and dirty. Every gesture was an act of pure love, a physical ministration intended to heal both the visible and invisible wounds. While she cared for him, she began to ask short, pointed questions, her voice low and even to keep him calm. Was it Brenda? Leo? Leo nodded, unable to trust his own voice. "Does your father know?" He shook his head. He's in Boston." Evelyn's eyes darkened with a cold fire. She had known. She had long suspected Brenda's true nature, seeing through her polished veneer to the selfishness and coldness beneath. But she had held her tongue out of respect for her son's decision, hoping she was wrong. Now, the truth had been revealed in the cruelest way imaginable, and all her restraint was gone. "All right," she said, her voice sharp as a razor. She stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. "You stay put. Drink this." She handed him a mug of hot, sweet tea, which his fingers were barely strong enough to hold. "I need to make a phone call." Evelyn went into the kitchen, and Leo could hear the beeps as she dialed the number on the old landline phone. He heard her voice, no longer the gentle tone she used with him, but a powerful, authoritative voice, the voice of a matriarch ready to go to war for her own. "Robert," she said, without any greeting. "It's Mom. Where are you?" Leo couldn't make out his father's response, just a distant, muffled sound over the phone. "I don't care where you are or what you're doing," Evelyn continued, her voice gaining intensity. "You need to listen to this. Brenda just threw Leo out of the house. On Christmas morning, do you hear me? He just showed up here, in his pajamas, barefoot, in the snow. She threw all of his belongings in trash bags and put him out. She locked him out." She paused, letting the words sink in. The silence on the other end of the line was long and heavy. Leo could picture his father standing somewhere, a hotel lobby, an airport terminal, with the phone pressed to his ear, his world collapsing. Then Leo heard his father's voice, no longer a mumble, but a sharp, clear sound, choked with disbelief and horror. "What? Mom? Are you serious? Have you ever known me to joke about something like this, Robert?" Evelyn shot back, her voice unforgiving. "He is here, right in front of me, practically frozen." The boy had to drag those bags for 2 miles in the snow. Leo heard a muffled curse from his father, a raw and violent sound he rarely heard from him. Then his voice came again, completely changed. The usual weariness and politeness were gone, replaced by a primal rage. The rage of a father realizing his child has been harmed in an unimaginable way, right under his watch. "Mom," Robert's voice trembled with fury. "Can you put Leo on the phone?" Evelyn brought the cordless phone to Leo. He pressed the cold receiver to his ear, his hand still shaking. "Leo? Son?" His father's voice came through, a mixture of anguish, regret, and a steely resolve. "Can you hear me?" "I hear you," Leo whispered. "I'm sorry," Robert said, and Leo could hear the suppressed sob in his voice. "God, I am so sorry. I should never have left. I should have known. I'm coming home. I'm getting on the first flight I can. I don't care what it costs or what I have to do. I am coming home. You stay with Grandma, okay? Don't go anywhere. You're safe now. I love you, son." Those words, simple but powerful, were like a healing balm. They were the validation Leo desperately needed. He was not alone. He was not at fault. His father was on his side, without a shred of hesitation. His father's rage was his own rage, amplified and legitimized. His unwavering support was a shield, protecting him from Brenda's poisonous words that he was not real family. He was family. He was his father's family, and his father was coming home to fight for him. Holding the phone, listening to his father's promise, Leo felt a real spark of hope for the first time in hours. Justice, perhaps, still existed. Time seemed to move strangely after that phone call. For Leo, it was a slow, hazy dream. He sat curled in the armchair, wrapped in warm blankets, sipping the hot chicken soup that Evelyn had quickly made for him. Warmth was gradually returning to his body, banishing the bone-deep chill. But that warmth was only superficial. Underneath, an emotional numbness persisted, a defense mechanism of a mind overwhelmed by trauma. He wasn't crying anymore. He simply existed, listening to the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. While Leo was in this state of suspension, Evelyn became a whirlwind of action. Her rage was not loud. It was a cold, methodical fury. First, she went out onto the porch and, with undisguised contempt, dragged the 3 trash bags into the garage, so they would no longer be a public spectacle of humiliation. Then she returned, made a few phone calls to family members, Leo's aunts and uncles briefly and clearly informing them of what had happened, and telling them that the planned Christmas appetizer gathering at her house was canceled. She was building a protective firewall around Leo, ensuring no one would come and disturb him with curious questions. But her most important action was preparing for Robert's return. She was like a general preparing a battlefield. She cleared the dining room table, brewed a strong pot of coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table, making a list. Leo could catch glimpses of what she was writing: divorce attorney, restraining order, bank accounts. She wasn't waiting for Robert to make decisions. She was providing him with a clear roadmap for action, a battle plan. Robert arrived just after sunset. He had managed to get a flight back to Hartford, then rented a car and driven like a madman through the light snowstorm that had started up again. When he walked through the door, he looked 10 years older. His eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep and anger, and there was a tension in his jaw that Leo had never seen before. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked straight to Leo, knelt before the armchair, and pulled his son into a hug. It wasn't a gentle hug. It was a fierce, almost desperate embrace, an attempt to transmit all his regret, love, and protection through a single act. Leo buried his face in his father's shoulder, and finally, his wall of emotional numbness shattered. He cried, and this time, Robert cried with him. After a long moment, Robert pulled back, but kept his hands on his son's shoulders. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his voice thick. "I will never forgive myself for leaving you alone with her." "It's not your fault," Leo whispered. "It is my fault," Robert said, his voice hardening. "I was blind, but I'm not blind anymore." He stood up and turned to his mother. "Mom," he said, his voice now devoid of grief and filled only with a cold resolve. "What's the plan?" That night, Evelyn's small house transformed into a war room. Robert and she sat at the kitchen table for hours, going over the list, making the necessary calls. Robert called his bank, freezing all their joint accounts. He left a voicemail for his lawyer, a brief and brutal message, demanding that divorce proceedings be initiated first thing the next morning. Throughout it all, Brenda tried to make contact. Robert's phone buzzed incessantly with her calls and texts. At first, they were angry, accusatory messages. Then, as she must have realized that Robert knew, they shifted to frantic excuses and finally to pathetic pleas. Robert didn't answer a single one. He simply handed the phone to his mother, who calmly blocked Brenda's number. The shattering of that false family was not a long, drawn-out, painful process. It was a swift, clean, and merciless amputation. Brenda had gambled everything on a single act of hate, and she had lost spectacularly. By trying to eliminate Leo to create a perfect family with just her and Robert, she had destroyed the very foundation of that family. Leo, listening from the living room, felt a strange sense of justice. It didn't bring him joy, but it brought him relief. The monster had been unmasked. The lie had been exposed. And the house built on a foundation of hatred and deceit was crumbling to dust. Justice may not always be swift, but tonight it had arrived like a hurricane, sweeping away the hypocrisy and leaving a clear path to start anew. 4 years. In the life of a young man, it is a century. It is the time it takes to transform from a vulnerable teenager into a self-sufficient adult, from a victim of circumstance into the architect of one's own destiny. For Leo, the 4 years following that fateful Christmas were not just a passage of time. They were a war, a grueling but ultimately liberating trial by fire. The first few months after the event were a controlled, chaotic blur. His father's divorce was swift and acrimonious. Brenda, realizing that apologies and tears were not working, turned venomous and hostile, trying to twist the narrative, painting a picture of Leo as a rebellious and difficult stepson. But her actions on Christmas morning had been too blatant, too cruel to be excused. Evelyn's testimony, combined with the evidence of her premeditation, sealed her fate. She left with very little. Her reputation in ruins and the bridge to Robert's family completely burned. The house they had once shared was sold, a necessary act to exorcise a haunted past. Leo and his father moved into a rented apartment in a neighboring town. It was a smaller, simpler space, but to Leo, it felt like a palace. It was safe. There were no cold stares, no simmering tensions, just two men trying to learn how to live again. Their relationship had changed. The traumatic event had shattered the emotional barrier that often exists between fathers and sons. Robert, tormented by guilt for not recognizing Brenda's cruelty sooner, became fiercely protective and open with Leo. They talked, truly talked, about everything: the pain, the loss, the fear. Leo went to therapy for a while, a safe space where he could unpack the complex feelings of abandonment and damaged self-worth. But the most effective medicine was the unwavering support of his father and grandmother. However, Leo knew he couldn't live under their protection forever. The scar Brenda had left had branded him with a bitter lesson. True security doesn't come from others, but from within. He resolved that he would never again be in such a helpless position. He would build his own life, a life that no one could take away from him. That resolution became his driving force. He threw himself into his studies in high school, graduating with honors. When it came time to choose a college, he made a decision that surprised his father. He turned down the prestigious faraway universities he had been accepted to and instead chose a good in-state public university so he could work his way through, easing the financial burden on his father. "I can provide for you, Leo," Robert had said, his voice laced with concern. "I know, Dad," Leo had replied, his voice now holding the steady timbre of adulthood. "But I need to do this, for myself." And he did. His college life was not one of parties and carefree days. It was long nights studying in the library, followed by late shifts at a local diner. It was learning to manage a tight budget, to fix his old clunker of a car with YouTube tutorials. Every dollar he earned, every exam he passed, was a brick he laid by hand in the foundation of his independence. He majored in computer science, a field that demanded logic, precision, and the ability to build something out of nothing, all qualities he was trying to cultivate in his own life. He was no longer the boy shivering in his pajamas. He had grown. He was taller, his shoulders broader, but the biggest change was in his eyes. The innocence was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve, a steady self-assurance that comes from having faced the abyss and climbed out on one's own. He was no longer afraid. He had learned that he could survive. When he graduated with high honors, it wasn't just an academic achievement. It was a declaration. He had made it. He had built himself up. A few weeks later, he landed a job at a promising tech startup in Hartford, with a good salary and room to grow. He rented his first apartment, a small, sunny space that was all his own. 4 years. In 4 years, he had gone from a survivor to a builder. He had taken the broken pieces of a demolished life and forged them into a solid foundation for the future. Brenda had tried to make him trash, but she had failed. She had inadvertently given him the cruelest and most valuable gift of all, a reason to become unbreakable. And now, with his life stable and peaceful, the past seemed to have receded, becoming a faded story about someone else, in another time. He had no idea that the past was about to come knocking. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The pale gold light of autumn slanted through the large windows of the office, casting a fine dust of gold over Leo's minimalist desk. The atmosphere in their startup office was always buzzing with energy, a mix of furious typing, spirited debates over lines of code, and the ever-present rich smell of coffee. Leo was in a state of deep focus, noise-canceling headphones on, immersed in debugging a complex piece of code. For him, this work was a form of meditation. It was orderly, logical, and every problem had a solution if you were patient enough to find it. It was a complete contrast to the unpredictable chaos of human emotion. He had found a comfortable rhythm for his life: work during the day, the gym in the evening, then home to cook a simple meal and read or play video games. On weekends, he would often drive to visit his father and grandmother, who remained the bedrock of his life. His life was not dramatic, and he liked it that way. He had had enough drama to last a lifetime. The past, with all its sharp edges and painful memories, had been carefully packed away in a locked box in his mind. He never spoke of Brenda. Her name was never mentioned. She had become a ghost, a villain in a story that had ended long ago. That's when his phone, lying face down on his desk, began to vibrate. Normally, he would have ignored it. When he was in the zone, he tried to avoid distractions. But this time, something was different. The vibration seemed more insistent, more urgent. With a soft sigh, he took off his headphones and flipped the phone over. An unknown number, a Connecticut area code. He frowned. It was probably a spam call, or a recruiter trying to poach him. He usually didn't answer unknown numbers, but a vague curiosity, an unexplainable premonition, made him hesitate. His thumb hovered over the red decline button, but he couldn't bring himself to press it. He considered the possibilities. It could be an old friend with a new number. It could be an issue with his apartment. There was no logical reason not to answer. But a deep part of him, a survival instinct honed by trauma, was screaming a silent warning. It felt like the same feeling he'd had that Christmas Eve, the feeling of a snake hiding in the grass. In the end, curiosity and a sense of defiance won. He wasn't going to be scared of an unknown phone number. He was stronger than that. He swiped the screen to green and pressed the phone to his ear, his voice professional and slightly distant. "Hello? This is Leo." There was a silence on the other end for a second or two, filled only by a ragged, shaky breath. Then, a voice came through. A voice he hadn't heard in 4 years, but one he recognized instantly. It was older, weaker, choked with sobs, but it was unmistakable. "Leo?" Time seemed to stop. The noise of the office, the chatter of his colleagues, the clicking of keyboards, it all faded away. His entire world shrank to that voice, a sound from a tomb he thought had been permanently sealed. It was her, Brenda. A complex and violent wave of emotions crashed over him. First came shock, a pure disbelief that this was actually happening. It was followed by a familiar cold anger that flared up from deep in his chest. And finally, most surprisingly, a hollowness, an almost clinical detachment. It was as if he were observing the scene from outside his own body. He said nothing. He simply listened, his own breath caught in his chest. He had no idea how she had gotten his number. Maybe from a distant, unknowing relative. It didn't matter. She had breached his defenses. The ghost had returned. "Leo, are you there?" Brenda's voice came again, desperate. "Please, don't hang up. I need to talk to you." The unexpected call from the past had shattered the peace he had worked so hard to build. It was like a crack appearing in a solid wall, threatening to bring the entire structure down. He was faced with a choice. He could hang up now, block the number, and pretend this call never happened. Or he could listen. He could face this ghost one last time, on his own terms. And in that moment, the 2 one-year-old man won out over the 1 7-year-old boy. He would not run anymore. He would listen. Leo remained silent, an active, weighty silence. He gave Brenda no feedback, no uh-huh or sigh for her to latch onto. He simply created a void, forcing her to fill it with her own words. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed out the window, watching a single red leaf spiral in the wind. He felt strangely detached, like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. His silence seemed to panic Brenda. She began to speak, the words tumbling out in a chaotic torrent of remorse and self-pity. "Leo, I am so sorry," she began, her voice choked with sobs. "God, I am so sorry. Not a day goes by that I don't think about what I did. It was the worst, most evil thing I have ever done in my life. I don't know what came over me." Leo listened, not with his heart, but with his intellect. He parsed her words, analyzing them the way he would analyze a faulty line of code. He immediately recognized a pattern. This apology, from its very first sentence, wasn't really about him. It was about her. "I am sorry. I don't know what came over me." It was an attempt to mitigate responsibility, to blame some external force, some temporary madness, rather than to acknowledge the ugly core of her own being. "I lost everything, Leo," she continued, her voice trembling. "After your father, after he left, my life just fell apart. I lost the house, I lost my friends. I hit rock bottom. But it forced me to take a hard look at myself. I've been in therapy. I've done so much work to understand why I did that. My therapist says it was about insecurity, jealousy. But that's no excuse." Leo almost scoffed. Again, it was all about her loss, her healing journey. She was presenting her own suffering as evidence of her change, as if the fact that she had endured the consequences of her actions automatically absolved her of the sin. She was trying to evoke pity, a classic manipulative tactic. The 17-year-old Leo might have fallen for it. The 21-year-old Leo did not. He had seen enough selfish apologies in his own therapy sessions, apologies designed not to heal the other person, but to soothe the conscience of the perpetrator. "I miss my family," Brenda whispered, and this was where the manipulation became most transparent. "I miss your father, and I miss you, Leo. I think about the good times. I know there weren't many, but there were moments." The sentence was left hanging, a baited hook. She was trying to rewrite history, to plant the idea in his mind that there had been a happy family that was broken, a family of which he was a part. But Leo knew the truth. There were no good times. There were only days that were less bad than others. There was only a temporary ceasefire in a long, cold war. "Please, Leo," she begged, her voice now almost a whine. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I'm just asking for a chance. Just one. Can we meet for coffee? Just to talk? I want to apologize to you in person. I need to do it, so I can move on." And there it was, the key to the entire phone call. I need to do it, so I can move on. This apology was not a gift for him, it was a demand. She was asking him to participate in the final step of her personal healing program. She was asking him to play the role of the forgiver so she could check the make amends box and feel good about herself. She wanted him to take on the emotional labor of granting absolution so that she could be freed from the burden of her guilt. The selfishness of it was breathtaking. 4 years ago, she had taken everything from him for her own selfish reasons. And now, She was back, not to give anything back, but to demand something more. She wanted his peace of mind, his validation, to make her own past more bearable. Leo finally felt a clear emotion cut through his detached exterior. It wasn't anger. It was a cold, clinical contempt. She hadn't changed. She may have learned the language of therapy and remorse, but her core remained the same. She was still a fundamentally self-absorbed person, a black hole of emotional need, constantly trying to pull everything from those around her to fill her own emptiness. He had heard enough. He had given her the chance to speak, and she had used that chance to prove she was still the same person he had always known. The conversation was over, even though it had never really begun. The silence Leo held after Brenda finished her plea was entirely different from the passive silence before. The earlier silence had been a tactic, a void for her to expose herself. This silence was a judgment. It stretched on, each second ticking by, as heavy as lead. Leo could hear Brenda's ragged, expectant breathing on the other end of the line. She was waiting for a word of comfort, a hesitation, the slightest sign that her speech had landed. But Leo felt no pity. He felt no rage. He felt only an absolute clarity, a cold peace that comes from knowing exactly what you must do. For 4 years, the memory of that day had been an open wound, occasionally throbbing with a dull ache at unexpected moments. He had built walls around it, learned to live with it, but it was always there. And now, he realized, this phone call, this selfish apology, had inadvertently given him a gift. It had given him the opportunity not just to close that wound, but to carve a headstone for it, a final declaration that would redefine the entire event on his own terms. He didn't need to scream. He didn't need to recount his suffering. He didn't need to argue or accuse. All of that would only give Brenda what she wanted, an interaction, an emotional connection, however negative. It would validate that she still had the power to affect him, and Leo would not grant her that satisfaction. He decided his response had to be like a surgeon's scalpel, precise, cold, and severing all hope of reconciliation. It had to encapsulate the entire truth of her actions, an irrefutable truth. He thought of the most powerful images from that day. Not her enraged face, not the slamming door, but them. The black trash bags, the ultimate symbol of his dehumanization, the symbol she had chosen. They were her weapon, and now he would make them his. Brenda finally broke the silence, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "Leo, are you still there? Please say something." Leo took a deep breath. He hung up the phone. He didn't want to speak the words aloud. A voice can betray emotion. A slight tremor, a moment's hesitation, could be misinterpreted as weakness. This response needed to be delivered perfectly, without any static. Instantly, his phone buzzed with an incoming text. Then another. "Brenda, Leo, please don't do this. Brenda, just talk to me one time. I'm begging you." He looked at the messages on the screen. They were evidence of her desperation. He opened the keyboard. His fingers moved over the letters calmly and deliberately. He did not hesitate. The sentence was already formed in his mind, perfect and complete. It was the crystallization of 4 years of pain, healing, and growth. He hit send. The blue message bubble appeared on the screen, a final and irrevocable statement. He felt an incredible sense of release, as if a weight he had been carrying for 4 years had finally been set down. He had spoken his truth, and it was all that needed to be said. The moment after Leo hit send was one of profound stillness. He stared at his phone screen, at the blue message bubble containing his 8 words. It sat there, an indelible final word, a concise and brutal indictment. In that moment, he realized he had just done something more important than rejecting an apology. He had reclaimed the narrative of his own story. For 4 long years, the story of that Christmas day had belonged to Brenda. She was the actor, and he was the reactor. She was the one who wrote the script, and he was just a passive character, dragged through her humiliating scenes. The memory, in his mind, had always been framed by her actions, the sound of her screams, the force of her hands, the contempt in her eyes. And her ultimate weapon, the symbol of her power over him, had been the trash bags. They were a perfect metaphor for how she saw him, something to be contained, tied off, and thrown away. Every time that memory surfaced, the image of the black trash bags against the white snow would appear, carrying with it the feelings of worthlessness and disposability. They were her weapon, and they had worked effectively, leaving deep psychological scars. But by sending that text, Leo had performed a powerful act of subversion. He had seized her weapon and made it his own. He didn't try to deny the existence of the trash bags. He didn't try to forget them. Instead, he embraced them, held them up, and shone a new light on them. He had changed their meaning. In Brenda's hands, they were a tool to dehumanize him. In his hands, they became a tool to expose her own inhumanity. His response said, in essence, "You chose those trash bags. You chose to define our relationship by that act. Fine. Now you get to live with it. Let the very symbol you use to humiliate me become the permanent definition of your failure to understand what family is." It was a move of a chess grandmaster. He hadn't flipped the board in a fit of rage. He had used his opponent's own piece to declare checkmate. He hadn't argued against her definition of family with platitudes about love and forgiveness. He had simply and irrefutably pointed out that her actions, the act of putting a person and their life into garbage bags, were inherently contradictory to any concept of family. The power of the response was not just in its content, but in its form. A text message. It was cold, distant, and unemotional. It denied Brenda the satisfaction of a fiery confrontation. She had wanted tears, screaming, an emotional release. Instead, she received a digital dispatch, a truth distilled to its purest form. It was like receiving a verdict by email. The distance of the medium amplified the coldness of the message. With this one act, Leo completed his transformation. The helpless, passive 7-year-old boy was left behind. The 1-year-old man, the one who had rebuilt his own life, was now the one holding the power. He was no longer a victim in Brenda's story. He had become the author of its final chapter. He had written an ending not about revenge, but about truth. He looked at the screen again. Below his message, the word "delivered" appeared. There was no indication that Brenda was typing a reply. Perhaps she was stunned. Perhaps she had nothing to say. The truth often has that effect. It silences people. Leo didn't care. He was done. He had reclaimed his voice, and he had used it to speak a simple, powerful, and liberating truth. He had turned his oppressor's weapon into his own shield, and in doing so, he had truly set himself free. The sounds of the office seemed to rush back in. The clicking of keyboards, the low hum of the servers, the sound of laughter from the kitchen area, the sounds of the normal life Leo had built for himself slowly seeped back into his consciousness. The minutes-long confrontation over the phone had been like a small, intense tornado that had passed through, leaving a strange calm in its wake. His phone still lay on the desk, the screen lit up with their brief exchange. He looked at it, not with anxiety, but with a sense of completion. He had done what needed to be done. He had faced the ghost and spoken the truth. But he knew the story wasn't quite finished. There was one final act to perform, an act not of aggression, but of protection. Brenda would likely try to call again. She might send more texts, perhaps angry ones, perhaps more desperate pleas. She might try to prolong this dialogue, searching for a crack, a sign of weakness she could exploit. She was like a toxin, and while he had administered the antidote, he still needed to ensure the source of the poison could not reach him again. With a calm decisiveness, Leo picked up his phone. He didn't reread the messages. He didn't need to. He opened his contacts. The unknown number Brenda had called from was still at the top of his recent calls list. He tapped on it. A menu of options appeared. Her voice, call history, and at the very bottom, in red letters, were 2 words: block this caller. His finger hovered over the screen for a second. This was not an act of cowardice. He wasn't running away. He had faced her. This was an act of self-care, a necessary boundary setting. It was the digital equivalent of building a strong wall around the peace he had worked so hard to achieve. It was the final declaration that he, and he alone, decided who was allowed into his life. He pressed the button. A confirmation window popped up. You will not receive phone calls, messages, or FaceTime from people on the block list. He tapped block contact, and that was it. With a simple touch, the digital door to the past was closed and locked. Brenda was expunged from his world, cleanly and efficiently. She couldn't call. She couldn't text. She had been returned to her ghost-like state, but this time, she was banished completely. Leo placed his phone back on the desk, face down, just as it had been before. But there was a difference. Before the call, it had been an act of focus, of tuning out distractions. Now, it was an act of finality. He felt a profound sense of relief wash over him. Not the elation of victory, but the deep peace of release. The burden he had carried for 4 years, the weight of an unresolved story, of an unspoken pain, had been lifted. He hadn't forgiven Brenda. He probably never would. Forgiveness is a gift, and she hadn't earned it. But he had freed himself from her. He had severed the final cord that connected him to her toxicity. She could continue to live with her own demons, but they would no longer be his problem. He put his headphones back on, but didn't immediately turn on the music. He just sat there, in his own private silence, and breathed, inhaling the peace of the present, exhaling the last vestiges of the past. The 7-year-old boy, shivering in the snow, had been comforted. The 1-year-old man sitting in the sunlit office was now completely free. After a moment, he turned back to his computer screen. The complex lines of code were still there, waiting to be solved. He smiled faintly. He liked problems that could be solved. He placed his fingers on the keyboard and began to type. Life went on. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt that the past was truly behind him, right where it belonged.